In the ever-evolving world of Hollywood, the glitz and glamour is all that is constant. There are new faces hitting the scene with every premiere, and it's not uncommon for even the brightest of stars to fizzle out before they want to. But Jim Carrey is one of the exceptions. From his comedic charm to his outstanding acting chops, Jim Carrey is a legend in the industry, and there's no doubt about that. Despite his immense fame and wealth, he hasn't seemed to let it get to his head, thriving in Hollywood as the exact same person that he was when he entered it. But although we all know him as a big-name celebrity, he hasn't always been that way. His path to becoming the comedy icon that we love today wasn't obstacle-free. In fact, quite the opposite. Before Jim was a reoccurring face on our television screens, he had a humble beginning to say the very least. He was born on January 17th, 1962, in the town of Newmarket in Ontario, Canada, and was the youngest of 4 kids. His parents weren't rich by any means, but they were able to get by. His dad was a musician and accountant, while his mum stayed at home, and for a while, that was okay. Jim attended the Blessed Trinity Catholic Elementary School in North York, Ontario, and while there, he began realizing that he had a natural affinity for comedy. It seemed like ever since he was a kid, it was clear that Jim was destined for the spotlight, and even he knew it himself. At just 8 years old, Jim was building up his skill set by practicing impressions and making faces in the mirror every single day. And unlike any regular 8-year-old, Jim was already confident in his abilities. Jim knew that he was good at what he did, and that there was a future for him in comedy, so he started to work towards that goal. When he was 10, he wrote a letter to Carol Burnett, an American comedian and actress who had her own comedy variety show called The Carol Burnett Show, which aired on CBS. In the letter, Jim expressed that he was already a master of jokes and impressions, and that he felt with his skills, he deserved a role on her show. Unfortunately for Jim, his time wouldn't come just yet. He did receive a reply for his letter, but it was just a template. But he didn't let that crush his dreams. As time went on, Jim's path to success got more and more complicated. When you grow up, you start noticing things that you didn't before. And for Jim Carrey, that was his mother Kathleen's illness. Although she was a stay-at-home mum, she wasn't always present in her interactions with her kids, and that's because she was struggling with addiction. "My mum was addicted to pain medication," Jim told People magazine. "She was very sick in a lot of ways. She was lovely too, but she was a child of alcoholics, and she had issues. And that's not intentional abandonment. She was always there for me. She was always there in the house. But if you're high on painkillers, that's abandonment. I guess we're all abandoned to a certain extent. All of us in some way or another, by something or someone. And that forms in us our belief about ourselves. My mother was a professional sick person. She took a lot of pain pills. There are many people like that. It's just how they are used to getting attention. I always remembered she's the daughter of alcoholics who'd leave her alone at Christmas time." On the other side of the coin, his father, Percy, was also dealing with his own personal battles. Percy had never felt like the work that he was doing was meaningful, and this was straining the family, not just financially, but emotionally. To make matters worse, his father was let go from his job when Jim was only 12 years old, and the family was left to survive off next to nothing. The tensions between his parents, his siblings, and Jim were very high, and it eventually took a toll on him. Jim fell into the wrong crowds, turning to different vices to let out his frustrations, stress, and sadness. He would get into fights, skip out on school, and ultimately put the blame on the world around him for his circumstances. And for a while, it seemed like he had abandoned his dreams of comedy. No matter how funny Jim could be, that wouldn't fix his problems. Laughter couldn't mend his broken home. But something did, and it's not what you would have expected. As the family's financial crisis worsened, they ultimately decided to leave their hometown of Newmarket and move an hour away to Burlington, Ontario, with nothing except a few belongings and a Volkswagen van. But this move was anything but easy. The family actually fell into a period of homelessness, with Jim's parents and his sisters living out of their van, while he and his brother toughed it out in a tent at Charles Daly Park, which was right on the Lake Ontario shore. Looking back on his life, this was a drastic change from the global sensation that we all know him to be now. One of the most famous actors in all of Hollywood spent his adolescent years on the street with nowhere to call home. Times were tough for Jim for a while, but he seemed to grow more appreciative and even closer to his family during all of this. Whether it was their mutual struggle or survival instinct that brought them together, no one really knows. But Jim does have fond things to say about this time of his life, especially in regards to his family. Now, fortunately for the Carrey family, things would start to look up after Percy landed a job in the accounting department at a tire factory called Titan Wheels in Scarborough, Ontario. Once again, Jim and his family packed their things and relocated to yet another new town, this time with hopes of finally settling down. And with Percy's new employment came another valuable opportunity. Titan Wheels gave the family permission to live in a house across the street from the factory. But in exchange, Jim and his brother John would have to work there. But unlike their father, they wouldn't be crunching numbers. They would be janitors. During the day, Jim would be attending classes at school, and after school, he'd be heading over to the factory to work a 6-hour shift from 6 p.m. all the way into the early morning. Despite how hard all this was for a teenage boy, Jim continued to persevere. He knew that his family needed his help, and that this job was the difference between being homeless and having somewhere warm to lay his head. After some time though, Jim decided that the juggle between work and school was no longer worth it. He had always been drawn towards the unorthodox and unconventional, having expressed his thoughts about traditional jobs multiple times in interviews. In fact, his first realization that he never wanted to do a 9-to-5 came to him as a child, when he was watching his dad work a job that he clearly wasn't passionate about. Because for Jim, his love of comedy and his funny bone didn't come out of the blue. His dad Percy had always been the go-to comedian in the family, able to light up any room with his humor and wit. But unlike Jim, he never took that leap of faith and pursued comedy as a career, always going for the safe jobs. Jim would go on to state, "He was an amazing, incredible character. I'm always drawing on my father to play characters. He was the kind of guy who, if you talked to him for 5 minutes, you felt like you knew him for 50 years. I would watch him hold court in the living room. People invariably left holding their bellies and going, 'Percy, you missed your calling.' And seeing the missed potential of his very own father, Jim knew that he didn't want to go down the same path. So he decided that he would rather fail at attempting to do what he loved instead of settling down for the mediocre and mundane. Jim further elaborated on this by saying, "My father could have been a great comedian, but he didn't believe that was possible for him. So he made a conservative choice and instead got a job as an accountant. When I was 12 years old, he was let go from that safe job, and our family had to do whatever we could to survive. I learned many great lessons from my father, not the least of which was that you can fail at what you don't want, so you might as well take a chance on doing what you love." Now, when Jim wasn't working at the factory, he was putting all of his time and effort into furthering his comedy career. At only 15 years old, he was already signing up for stand-up comedian gigs at one of the most popular comedy clubs in Toronto called Yuck Yuck. In a 2017 interview with People magazine, Carrey reflected on that initial experience, admitting, "I stood up there and did this awful cheesy act." The owner of Yuck Yuck, Mark Breslin, even described Jim as a bad rich little. But despite gaining a less than enthusiastic response and essentially being booed off the stage, Carrey remained undeterred, a resilience he had learnt young after many hardships. By 1979, when Jim was 17, he was already making a good amount of money from doing comedy. He had turned his reputation around, going from an inexperienced rookie to a fan favorite in a matter of months, through polishing his act and perfecting his punchlines. Since his family situation had improved, Jim had more time to devote to his craft. With a supportive father behind him, who drove him to all of his gigs, Jim was able to quickly develop his comedic prowess. He soon became a complete natural at working crowds, turning into a go-to comedian at Yuck Yuck's early into his time there. His trademark, high energy and diverse repertoire of impressions quickly became his calling card. And soon, he was doing shows in comedy clubs all across Canada. It was very rare for someone so young to be such a bright, entertaining comic, and anyone who went to his shows knew that it was just the start of something much bigger for Jim. All of his material was completely original, and his impressions were completely spot on. Combine that with his contagious spirit and expert delivery, it wasn't surprising that it didn't take long for his knack of comedy to catch the attention of more seasoned pros and entertainment execs. Now, Jim had dipped a toe into acting once his comedy gigs started gaining traction, and by the summer of 1981, he had already acted in an episode of the televised stand-up show, An Evening at the Improv. But that was still all about his humor. So when the summer of 1981 came around, and Jim was offered a real acting gig, he couldn't refuse. He landed the leading role in the CBC made-for-TV movie, Introducing Janet. where he played a struggling comedian who befriends a witty schoolgirl. The movie premiered in September of that same year, and the audience reactions were incredible. The first airing of the movie had over 1 million viewers, and Jim Carrey started becoming a household name, not just in comedy, but also with the general public. The first airing of the movie had over 1 million viewers, and Jim Carrey started becoming a household name, not just in the comedy-loving households of Canada, but also with the general public. Introducing Janet would go on to play countless reruns on Canadian TV channels, and was even renamed years later to Rubberface, which is what we all know it as today. Knowing that was just the beginning of his career in acting, at the age of 19, Jim decided to take things one step further, hoping to make it into the big leagues. He said goodbye to his family and his life in Canada, and bought a one-way ticket to Los Angeles, never to look back. As Jim Carrey had once said, life opens up opportunities to you, and you either take them, or you stay afraid of taking them. Soon after he got there, he landed a gig at Mitzi Shore's Comedy Store, a renowned comedy club in West Hollywood. Immediately, Jim was capturing the hearts of the crowd, with each show being an absolute hit. Jim was taking gigs left, right, and center, trying to get his name out there, and it worked. Jim soon became the opening act for comedians like Buddy Hackett and Rodney Dangerfield, touring all across the country with them and building up his own fan base as he went. But Jim never forgot where he came from. Even in the midst of his increasing fame, Jim did return to Toronto to pay homage to his roots, delivering 2 phenomenal sold-out shows at Macy Hall in 1982. As much as he loved comedy, Jim had also developed a passion for being in front of the camera. His first acting gig had really sparked something in him, and by the end of the year, Jim Carrey was already waiting for a United States work permit, ready to cement himself as one of the greats in Hollywood. But before he did, he managed to snag a comedian spot on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson in November 1983, making 10-year-old Jim proud by finally appearing on a television show, just like he had initially wanted. But this decision to turn to acting was one of the best that he's ever made, because as it turns out, Jim Carrey was meant to be a star. Just shortly after his debut performance as an actor, Jim Carrey would secure himself his first feature film role in 1984 film Finders Keepers. And just months after that, he would land himself a gig as the leading role in the 1985 teen horror comedy Once Bitten. And just like that, it all snowballed. Jim was in and out of set every single day, his phone blowing up with opportunities to act in films and on television, all while maintaining his reputation as one of the best up-and-coming comedians. By the 1990s, Jim already had an impressive resume backing him, and in 1991, Jim starred in his first TV special called Jim Carrey, Unnatural Act, which became a cult classic in the world of comedy. The success of the special led to Jim getting a reoccurring main role in Living Color, the popular 90s sketch comedy series, which has starred the likes of Keenan Ivory Wayans, Jamie Foxx, and Jennifer Lopez. Jim was a series regular until the show ended in 1994, and that's when he shifted all of his focus to his acting career. From then on, Jim became a familiar face on the big and silver screens, with his performances in box office hits Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, shooting him into A-list celebrity status. From then on, everything Jim touched was magic. He took on leading roles in cinematic classics in 1994's Dumb and Dumber and The Mask, which are roles that he is still praised for today. Although Jim was already wildly successful, these films truly locked him in as one of Hollywood's favorite actors, and the rest was history from there. Through his work in box office hits like Batman Forever, Liar Liar, The Truman Show, and How the Grinch Stole Christmas, more and more people began to recognize Jim for not just his hilarious improv and stand-up skills, but also his acting ability. Jim would cement this by saying, "If I had never ventured beyond being a stand-up comic, then I would be sitting in my house today, working on my Leonardo DiCaprio impression." But while it seemed like Jim was finally living out his dreams, it wasn't all that he had expected, because life in the spotlight was not just filled with pressure, but also loneliness. And soon, Jim would spiral into a dark hole that many Hollywood celebrities had found themselves all too familiar with: depression. By the 2000s, Jim was at the peak of his success, booking acting gigs left and right, all while maintaining his original charisma and wit. Despite all of his accomplishments, Jim still seemed like the same guy from Newmarket, Ontario, that just wanted to make people laugh. But as we all know, it's often the happiest people on the outside that struggle the most internally. Jim Carrey has always been open about his fight with depression, having touched upon it in interviews several times. In fact, he's even honed in on how becoming a celebrity is not what it seems, and realizing that your childhood dreams may be different when you finally make them a reality. Jim Carrey would state, "I think everybody should get rich and famous and do everything that they ever dreamed of so they can see that it's not the answer." Growing up with a mother that suffered from substance abuse, Jim knew firsthand the detrimental effects that mental health could have on a person and the damaging vices that they turn to cope. And unfortunately, he also followed in his mother's footsteps. From having a rough childhood to succumbing to the suffocating pressures of Hollywood, Jim, like many stars, was a substance abuser. He's opened up about his long-term dependency on pills like Prozac and how depression has drastically affected his life and well-being. But in light of this, Jim has also given his stance on how to combat depression, giving credit to things like spirituality, which have helped him through the darkest times of his life. Depression is your body saying, "I don't want to be this character anymore. I don't want to hold up this avatar that you've created in the world. It's too much for me." You should think of the word depressed as deep rest. It needs deep rest from the character that you've been trying to play. But even as Jim embraced spirituality and looked at his mental illness from a new perspective, there were still many obstacles he had to overcome, one of which being his shattered relationship with his ex-girlfriend, Catriona White. On September 28th, 2015, Catriona White, who was a beautician and hairstylist, was found dead in her home in Sherman Oaks, California, after an alleged suicide. The cause of death was a lethal overdose with prescription drugs, which according to Catriona's then husband, was introduced to her by Jim Carrey. Jim and Kath dated on and off between 2012 and the time of her passing, and the relationship was toxic to say the least. Kath had been suffering from severe depression, often threatening to harm herself throughout the duration of her relationship with the actor. So when news broke about her unfortunate passing, many started to point fingers at Jim, accusing him of having some relation to her death. These allegations were made worse when messages were found between the two where Catriona had accused Jim of giving her 3 STDs before their breakup. And to make the case much worse for Jim, a suicide note by Catriona was made public, in which she wrote, "Jim, you ruined my life, and even after doing so, you added insult upon insult on top." The reason why so many people blamed Jim Carrey for her passing was not only from these messages, but also from the prescription drugs. They were brought under the name Arthur King, which many had guessed was Jim's alias, tying the possession of these drugs back to him. If true, that would have made him directly related and partly responsible for her passing. Catriona's then husband had even filed a lawsuit against the actor for that reason, claiming that his supply of prescription drugs were the reason that she committed suicide, as he believed that Jim had introduced her to the substances in question. As of 2018, the claims and the case have been dismissed, with Jim being proven innocent after all. But this has undoubtedly still taken a toll on him, especially considering how close and in love he was with Catriona back in 2012. The road to fame and fortune is anything but easy, and Jim's bittersweet journey to where he is today goes to show where hard work, resilience, and determination can get you, especially if you refuse to let your surroundings change who you are at your core. So whether you know Jim Carrey as the Grinch, Truman Burbank, or as a hysterically entertaining comedian, one thing is for sure: Jim is undoubtedly one of the most famous actors in the world. Even after all these years, he can still confidently say that he never let go of who he really was, even after so many trials and tribulations in and out of Hollywood.